Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Spratt from Sports Info Solutions, and I'm joined by Schatz of Football Outsiders. Before we get started with today's topics, I want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and it shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the last 3 years. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, go on over to FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Aaron, I hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving. I think we had some pretty entertaining football over that period, maybe a few more blowouts than we would have liked on the day itself, but we're kind of in the home stretch of the NFL season now, and I feel like a lot of the races in the divisions are clearing up. But there are a few holdout divisions that I think we want to talk about today where at least maybe I'm projecting a little bit, but I feel like they could be up for grabs a little bit.
I was going to say clearing up. It seems like many of them have been pretty clear from early on.
Yeah, you may be true along those lines as well.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, the one division that I thought was pretty decided is unclearing up, and that's the NFC North, where Green Bay has really declined over the last few weeks, and Minnesota, which was winning close games but not, performing that well according to DVOA, our ratings on a play-by-play basis, has gotten a lot better.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about both Green Bay and the Vikings in recent weeks, but some of the most interesting jumps in DVOA this week actually happened with the other two teams in the division. First, with Detroit, they moved from 28th in total DVOA to 16th. And it kind of makes sense when you look at their recent performances. They've beaten the Packers, the Raiders, and the Eagles in the last 3 weeks. They started the season 0-7, and they're now up to 4-7. Or they started at 1-7. So, I mean, a huge turnaround there. There might be a little bit of a question if it's too late for them. But the Bears are one game in front of the Lions, and they jumped from 27th to 19th in DVOA and have won 3 of their last 4 games, including on Thanksgiving over the Packers. So let me just sort of start by asking you, Aaron, is it possible that the North is a little bit up for grabs?
It is up for grabs, but I still think it's up for grabs between the Vikings and the Packers, and I still think it's very likely. I mean, not still think, because I didn't think this a couple weeks ago necessarily about the Vikings, but at this point it looks like both teams will make the playoffs. The Vikings and Packers will very likely both make the playoffs. The playoff odds report, we have the Vikings making the playoffs 90% of the time and the Packers 84% of the time. I mean, as much as it's nice how Detroit and Chicago have improved in recent weeks, being behind by so many games is a huge, obstacle to overcome. Chicago is 3 games behind Minnesota, and Detroit is 4 games behind Minnesota. So while they have a chance to make the wild card, we have either Chicago or Detroit winning a wild card in 15% of our current simulations. The odds of those teams winning the division are tiny, less than a 1% chance that either Chicago or Detroit wins the NFC North. It's just the wins and losses gap is too much to overcome, and the fact is that we do try to look longer term than just 3 weeks or so, even with weighted DVOA, which lowers the strength of earlier games. It's still using almost full strength for all the games of the last 2 months. And using those metrics, Minnesota and Green Bay are still better than Chicago and Detroit, along with also being ahead of them.
That all makes sense. Maybe I'm just sort of fantasizing a little bit about how interesting this could potentially get. And the thing that sort of really stands out to me is the remaining schedule for these teams does actually seem to really favor the Lions and the Bears, which you would expect from last year's finishes, I suppose. Just looking at the Vikings remaining, they have the Seahawks, Cardinals, Giants, and Packers left on the schedule, as well as the Bears themselves. So, you could see them losing several of those games. And, with the Lions and the Bears, they just have a much easier slate, in addition, apart from the teams in their division that they would actually then need to beat to have success. So
the schedule number is based on average DVOA of opponent.
Yes.
Schedule so far this year, the hardest schedule in the league has belonged to San Francisco, but Chicago is second, Detroit third.
Okay.
Schedules the rest of the way, Detroit is 30th, Chicago is 28th, Minnesota is 4th.
Wow. Obviously that's a huge turnaround. But, you're probably right. It's probably just too late given the actual win-loss records of the teams involved. But we don't have to just talk about this season, because what I think we might have here is next year a division where 3 of the teams, maybe even 4, could be in the mix for, wild card spots at the very least. So let's see if we can figure out a little bit of what's sort of fueled the Lions' turnaround to start with. The thing that sort of, I guess, stood out on the Thanksgiving game was how big a day Calvin Johnson had. He seemed more involved than in previous weeks. But one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of their statistics seem pretty similar over the last 3 games as they did earlier in the season when they were much less successful. Like, for instance, Matthew Stafford's yards per attempt prior to Week 10, 7.0. Since Week 10, 7.8. I mean, that's a pretty similar ranking there. Is there anything on the offensive side that seemed to really improve to you that sort of is driving the turnaround here?
I'll say that Calvin Johnson being so involved on Thanksgiving, I think, has a lot to do with the Philadelphia defense. They're the worst defense in the league against number 1 receivers.
Okay.
So I think that was more about planning for that opponent than a change in the offense. The Detroit offense, the change has almost entirely been turnovers. In the first 8 games of the season, Detroit had 12 interceptions and 8 fumbles. And by the way, they only recovered 2 of those fumbles. In the last 3 games, the Detroit offense has thrown only 1 interception and had only 1 fumble, which they recovered themselves. So the yards per play have not changed much. The yards per play have gone from 5.3 to 5.4. And the success rate of the Detroit offense has gone from 43% to 45%. It's mostly in turnovers that we're seeing a change on offense.
Yes, and the Lions had the most turnovers in the league through the first 10 weeks of the season. They had 20 over those first 9 weeks, which is only 8 games, so just a ton. So you can sort of expect that turnaround. I think for the entire season, the Packers only have maybe 8 turnovers, and the Vikings maybe only have 9 or 10. So obviously that's a really huge difference. What about defensively? Because I feel like they've also made some improvements there. It's not really showing up in the sacks and pressures numbers too much. Over the first 10 weeks, they had 45, which was middle of the pack in the NFL. Last 3, they've had 20, which is 10th in the NFL. But I'm wondering if there might be other places on the defense where they've actually made some improvements.
Yeah, I don't know what has caused the defensive improvement. I know that Rasheed Mathis got injured, but he was, actually playing reasonably well. So all of a sudden, the last 3 weeks, so this is not about turnovers. The Lions actually have no interceptions in the last 3 weeks. So their defense has actually improved from 6.2 yards allowed per play in the first 8 games to 4.5 in the last 3. Success rate of offenses has improved from 45% to 39%. So the defense has made the significant improvement in yards and preventing first downs that the offense hasn't made, where the offense it's been mostly about turnovers. And I'll also say that looking at the defense, both against the run and the pass, just huge improvements. But the biggest improvement is actually second down. So offenses against the Lions in the first 9 games had a 50% success rate on second down. In the last 3 games, it's 35%. So the Lions actually have roughly the same success rate allowed on third down as they did when they were 1-7, the early part of the season. But the yards allowed on third down have been smaller. There just haven't been as many big plays on third down. And not as many of those third downs have been converted because there's been more yards to go because the second downs have been so good.
That's really interesting. I feel like the Lions, even if they're not necessarily in the playoff mix at this point, they'll be an interesting team to watch down the stretch, potentially playing spoiler, but also just looking forward to next year to see if they can actually be better defensively the way that we kind of thought they would be before the season started, even after losing Sue and some of their other pieces. With the Bears, I'm not sure, at least for me, I'm not sure how much of this is about improvements they've been making on the field. It's more sort of just a change in my mind of earlier in the year, I just thought this team was done. I think people talked about them as being a potential number 1 overall pick in the draft candidate. But when you actually look back at the season they've had, a lot of their losses have been against quality teams. So this year they've lost to the Packers, Cardinals, Seahawks, Lions, Vikings, and Broncos. I feel like the Lions are the only team you could quibble there as being maybe a bad opponent. And they've beaten several quality teams, including the Raiders, Chiefs, Rams, and Packers. Maybe just the Bears are better than I gave them credit for all year. What are your thoughts about them?
Yeah, actually, first of all, a lot of what the Bears' low DVOA rating at the first part of the season was just Jimmy Clausen.
Which I'm quite familiar with how that could be an issue. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you know how that is, being down in Carolina?
Well, that was John Fox's nightmare, is to get away from Carolina and then a few years later end up with Clausen back at quarterback starting for him.
It was his choice, for crying out loud. His choice to keep Clausen as the backup, I suppose, but Clausen's gone now. Game and a half that Clausen played was awful. Seattle, that's also part of the reason why Seattle's DVOA is a little higher than, it's a lot higher, I think, than people think given their record, but a little bit of that is the Clausen effect. But that being said, also Chicago's defense has improved, so they had their bye week in week 7. Weeks 1 to 6, the Chicago defense on third downs had 32% DVOA. They were allowing offenses to be successful on third down 49% of the time. In the last 5 games, third downs, 18% DVOA. That's still not good, but it's better. And they're allowing offenses to be successful on third down only 35% of the time. So overall, the Chicago defense has gone from being 26th in defense before their bye week to being 17th or 18th. I'm looking at the screen right now. 17th since their bye week in the last 5 games. So that defensive improvement, plus getting Clausen off, not having Clausen for a game and a half, has been the improvement, along with the schedule getting easier, means that close losses become close wins because you're not playing, the teams that are as difficult as the teams you played earlier in the season.
So, maybe don't place a bet on this necessarily, but it's possible that either the Lions or the Bears could make this thing a little bit interesting towards the end of the season, at least to get a wild card spot, and maybe most especially if the Packers continue to struggle and maybe cede their spot.
I think what makes it interesting a little bit is the sort of the idea of them playing spoiler, but the problem is Chicago doesn't play Green Bay, they only play Minnesota, and Detroit doesn't play Minnesota, they only play Green Bay.
Right.
So if the way that the NFC North was set up was like the AFC South, where they all were playing each other in the last few weeks, that would give these teams a better chance to play spoiler. But it unfortunately doesn't work out that way. The other thing I'll say is that if you talk about going forward to next year, I think there's big cap questions about whether these teams, Chicago and Detroit, are going to want to keep their quarterbacks. In particular Cutler because nobody likes him. So I don't know whether this continues into next year because I don't know who the quarterbacks are for these teams, whereas I'm pretty sure I know who the quarterbacks are for the 2016 Packers and Vikings.
Going out on a limb there, for sure. Okay, so, maybe this is a bit of a pipe dream that this division is up for grabs, but I feel like the NFC East definitely still is up for grabs. I think, though, so we were talking about how the Lions and Bears both improved dramatically in DVOA from Week 12 to Week 13. The team that I think improved its playoff odds the most from Week 12 to Week 13 is the Redskins, if I'm not mistaken, because they actually beat their division rival Giants to get that edge in the division. So let's start with this. Are the Redskins the favored team now to win the NFC East? And if so, what do you have as their playoff odds?
Yes, they are the favorites, and for 2 reasons. One was they won over the Giants. The second was that Tony Romo broke his collarbone again.
Oh, right.
So a lot of the year, our expectations for Washington were based on the idea that, well, they're playing Dallas twice in the last 5 weeks. Romo will be back by then, so those games are going to be a lot harder to win. Now there is no Romo. Those games suddenly become much easier to win. All season long, we've been thinking the last month of the year is pretty hard for Washington. Instead, it turns out the last month of the year is really easy for Washington because the Eagles have fallen apart the last couple of weeks. To a ridiculous extent.
Yes.
And the Cowboys now suddenly don't have Tony Romo. So, yeah, the Bears look a little tougher, and the Bills are still interesting, but all of a sudden, Washington's last 5 games look much, much easier, and especially much, much easier than the Giants' last 5 games. So that's why we now have the Washington winning the division 54% of the time, to the Giants only 28%, Philadelphia 16%, and Dallas 2%.
So the Giants have the Jets at the Dolphins, Panthers at the Vikings, and Eagles remaining on the schedule. If the Eagles have truly imploded, then maybe that game's easy. But obviously the Panthers are a tough game. Obviously the Vikings are tough, and the Jets. But being
which
at the
is not
Dolphins
really a
on the
home
road,
game. Which is, I mean, I don't quite know how to consider home field advantage. The ticket sales go to Giants season ticket sale holders, and the stadium will be ringed in Giants paraphernalia. But both teams get to use their home locker rooms. And as far as the sort of subconscious officials' effect of home field advantage, I don't know if there really is any.
Right. I mean, that makes sense to me. The Redskins, it's kind of eerily similar to the Panthers in that earlier in the year when the Falcons were doing so well, it seemed like they had difficult remaining opponents. So now that the Falcons have fallen back to earth, their chances of going, undefeated or whatever else you want to look at have improved dramatically. That's what the Redskins are seeing with the Cowboys here. And that's interesting. So obviously then the Redskins do have the easier path to winning the division at this point. But do we actually think the Redskins are a better team than the Giants at this point?
I can't believe this, but yes. Isn't that strange?
It so seems strange. I think I'm a little biased because in watching them 2 weeks ago against the Panthers, I think they committed 5 turnovers. They turned the ball over like every 8 offensive plays. And just in my mind, that's what I've always thought about Cousins and this offense, was that they just put the ball on the ground or threw interceptions. That actually really hasn't been the case on the season as a whole. They're more middle of the pack in turnovers, so maybe they actually are in a decent team.
Yeah, I mean, here's the problem with Washington and the Giants, right? Washington played in Carolina's best game of the year. So Carolina is one of the top teams in the league, and their best game of the year came against Washington. So we're looking at Washington being like, oh my God, they're awful. The Giants played maybe one of their best games of the year, certainly the worst game of the year for one of the best teams in the league, which is New England. I mean, I think New England was worse against the Giants than they were against the Broncos. And DVOA backs that up because, the Broncos are a tougher team to play against. And that game went to overtime, and the Patriots had poor fumble luck. So the Patriots' worst effort of the year really was against the Giants. And a lot of people watched that game nationally. So nationally, your image of the Giants is keeping close with one of the best teams in the league. And your image of Washington, especially for you as a Carolina fan,
right,
is getting crushed by one of the best teams in the league. But if you look at the whole season, after this week changed the order between the teams, right? So last week we had the Giants 12th and Washington 20th. This week, because of that game, we have Washington 15th and the Giants 17th. So I think it's accurate to say that they're pretty much even over the course of the year. Both teams have been below average on offense and defense. I certainly think for the Giants that there are offensive injuries that can be blamed for a lot of that. Victor Cruz never came back. The offensive line, I mean, they're down to pulling guys out of the stands at this point on the offensive line. Both teams have shockingly good special teams, considering that these are teams that have not been good at special teams in the past. I mean, Washington has this streak of like 10 or 11 years until like 2013, where they were among the worst special teams in the league, and then last year they were okay, and this year they've got actually really good special teams, which is weird. But the two teams actually come out kind of similar in their offensive, defensive, special teams split. I think both teams, the passing games have been better than the running games, even though with Washington we thought they were going to be more run-oriented. It hasn't really been that way. Washington's rush offense is 31st in the league in DVOA, which is kind of a bit of a shock. So Cousins has sort of become the turnover resistant, except against Carolina. Guy that Eli Manning's career, he gradually developed to where he didn't throw as many picks for the most part, and Cousins has sort of had that happen this year. So yeah, as weird as it is to say, Washington, I think the two teams are even, but if you look at their injuries going forward, considering that the Giants just had more offensive line injuries, while Washington's only had Deshaun Jackson back for a week or two, I think you can say that Washington looks slightly better.
This probably isn't entirely fair, specifically because of Romo's injury, but I've been skeptical a lot of the year when you've suggested that maybe the NFC East actually is pretty decent division, even if their records didn't really seem to indicate the fact. Are we sort of still there at this point, or do we think that maybe this division has fallen off with the injuries or for whatever reason, and that maybe it is the worst division in football?
It's definitely fallen off. I mean, the Eagles' defense the last 2 weeks
I don't even know what happened.
So bad. But, yeah, I know people are like, oh, they're picking on the secondary, which has been a weakness all year. Okay, fine, but it's the same guys that were, those guys were a weakness when that team was shutting offenses down. Did it take, I swear to God, it could not have taken other teams 10 weeks of film to figure out where the weaknesses were in the Philadelphia secondary. I'm not buying that.
Yeah, you should just blame Chip Kelly like everyone else, Aaron. It's the easy thing to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like, wow, hey, look, teams know what their offense looks like now. But honestly, teams knew what their offense looked like at the beginning of the year, too. What was carrying them for a long time was the defense, right? It's not like the Chip Kelly offense suddenly has problems the last 2 weeks that it didn't have early in the year. It's the defense that's dramatically changed. But as far as the two divisions, DVOA would still say Washington and the Giants are better than any team in the AFC South. But I think with the fall of Dallas and Philly, I think you could probably say that the two divisions are kind of even at this point. Houston's been playing a little better. Indy will get luck back at some point. And despite the conventional stats, advanced stats say that Indy has been better with Andrew Luck. A lot of that is just because of one game, because of the Denver game, but still.
But that was a great game. So,
I think when you consider that game and when you consider Andrew Luck of the past, I think you'd have to think that Indy with a healthy Luck would be better than Indy with Hasselbeck. There's no question that because of the schedule that each division plays, that the odds of a losing team or an 8-8 team winning a division are now much higher in the NFC East than the AFC South, where it used to be the other way around.
And the dream is still alive for that flexed Texans-Jaguars game for Week 17, right?
No, that dream is pretty dead.
Oh, no.
Honestly, I think the Jaguars losing to San Diego killed that dream. We only have the Jaguars winning the division 6% of the time now. It's mostly between Houston and Indy at this point. Scary to say, I think the bigger dream, or shall I say nightmare, would actually be for a flexed Giants-Eagles game in Week 17.
Oh, no.
Please, not the NFC East again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll shed a tear for that. We have one more topic to cover, Aaron, but before we get there, I want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is brought to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and that shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, check out FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. A lot of the year, Aaron, I feel like we've been talking about how there was this clear tier of top teams, maybe 3 or 4 teams depending on when you were in the year. Obviously, New England was involved, the Bengals, the Cardinals, a couple of other teams. But all of a sudden, it seems like the DVOA rankings are getting a lot more bunched up. Obviously, injuries have hurt the Patriots a lot, and the Cardinals have stopped blowing out teams, so they've been sort of cooling down, falling a little bit back to the pack. Meanwhile, you've had teams like the Chiefs, the Panthers, and the Seahawks perform better of late and have been sort of moving up. All of a sudden, the top 6 teams in DVOA are all between 25% and 33%. First, is that sort of an unusual bunching, or is that something that happens a lot because of the general parity, I guess, that exists in the league?
No, this is unusual. And it's not unusual because the 6th best team is at 25% or higher. It's unusual because the best team is only at 33%. So I went back and looked. And the Bengals are, of the 26 years that we have DVOA ratings, 27 years. This is the 4th lowest team after Week 12. That was at number 1.
Wow.
So the only 3 teams that were number 1 at this point, lower than the Bengals, were the 2010 Steelers, the 2006 Chargers, and the 2000 Titans. Normally at this point, the top team is between 35 and 40%. Okay? And you're really seeing the other side of the league also is like that. The 49ers are now only at minus 34. And every other team in the league is at minus 22 or better. It's a really strange year. Only 13 teams are above average by DVOA. But only 1 team is below minus 22, which is usually there's going to be 3 or 4 teams that are that low this year. There's just a lot of bad but not really bad teams this year. And the good teams have won a lot of games, but they're not dominating great. They're not great, historically great teams. The teams that are leading the league are not great, historically great teams. I'm sorry to say this to you as a Carolina fan.
Oh, you're going to burst my bubble right here, I can tell.
Well, you know that 538 ran that article
yes.
earlier this week that the Panthers are the worst 11-0 team ever, and people were like, "Oh, this is terrible." And no disrespect to Doug Farrar, former Football Outsiders writer, who's now at Sports Illustrated, but he posted something saying, that this is why stats analysis needs to have film work. Well, the problem is that Doug has not done film work on all 12 11-0 teams. He doesn't know if this team is better than the 1969 Rams because we weren't alive in 1969. But statistically, by their method, the Panthers are the worst of the 12 teams since 1966. They picked that. I know why they picked that as the line. They picked that as the line so they didn't have to think about the year that the Colts started 11-0-2. Of those 12 teams, the Panthers are the worst. By our numbers, by the way, they're not. Of our numbers, the teams in DVOA history that have been 11-0, it's the 2011 Packers that are the worst. But the Panthers are still there. This is not the 2007 Patriots. This is not the 96 Packers. By the way, the same is true of the Patriots. I'm a Patriots fan, right? They're 10-1. Brady's revenge tour. We're going to destroy the whole league. We're going to laugh at Roger Goodell when we win the trophy at the end of the year. No, we have not. The Patriots have not dominated. I say we because I'm a fan, and I'm sorry, fans get to say we.
Oh, I do
That's
that.
how it works.
100%.
That's how sports works. I know people hate that, but okay. The Patriots did not dominate the league this year when they started 10-0. They just didn't. Early in the year, there was a point where the Patriots were historically dominant, but that has gone away. And the same with Arizona, right? So those teams have come back to the pack. And I'll tell you where you really see it is offense, okay? The Bengals are the second lowest top offense after 12 weeks in DVOA history.
Wow.
The only number one offense in Week 12 that was lower was the 2008 Giants. So that's interesting, right? That's the year Brady was hurt. So pretty much every year, a Brady offense, a Manning offense, or a Drew Brees offense would blow away the rest of the league by this point. Or maybe Aaron Rodgers in recent years, right?
Yeah.
And this year, none of that is happening. So the Bengals have the number one offense, but not particularly high. The Rams are currently the lowest defense. Okay, thanks to Brock Osweiler, Denver no longer holds that title. The Rams are the lowest defense at 21.5% below average. That is the worst offense we've ever measured through 12 weeks.
Wow. So, I mean, the thing that makes this so interesting, I feel like, is how it's sort of antithetical to what's going on with the actual team win-loss records.
That's right. Completely different.
And so that sort of brings me to a question for you, Aaron, which is, given that the extreme win-loss records are going to give the relatively best teams, home field advantages and things like that in the playoffs, but they're not necessarily much better than the other teams they'll be playing. Does this sort of leave us with the playoffs where any team in the playoffs has a pretty good chance to win it all? Or does the fact that, let's say like the Panthers, for whatever, if they're like fourth in DVOA or whatever it is, but they're also at home throughout the entire playoffs, does that bump them back up and give them a really good chance of actually getting through the gauntlet?
Yep. Basically, win-loss records are much more important than DVOA ratings at this point when it comes to Super Bowl odds. And the fact is that for most of the year, since like week 5 or 6, it started, it's become clear that only 5 or 6 teams had a significant shot at bye weeks. And the bye week teams always have a much better chance to win the Super Bowl, not only because they have that bye to rest, but because we know that they'll get home field in at least one playoff game. And because they don't have to play that third game, right? Like, even if you played the worst team in the league in the wild card round, you'd still have a 10% chance of losing.
Right.
And in reality, you end up having, the best team. There's 3 great teams in the AFC, right? Right now, the wins and losses wise. Let's forget about Kansas City being awesome by DVOA, but wins and losses wise, right? It's the Patriots, the Bengals, and the Broncos. Whichever one of those teams doesn't get a bye is going to have a 33 to 40% chance of losing in the first week that the other 2 teams don't have to face.
Yeah, that's just such a huge advantage.
It's a huge advantage. And so this year, is really stratified as far as the Super Bowl odds, and have been for a long time. So right now, we only have 5 teams that have a 10% or better chance of winning the Super Bowl by our reckoning. Carolina, New England, Cincinnati, Arizona, Denver. Those are the 5 teams that have a significant shot at a bye week. I mean, Green Bay or Minnesota wins a bye week in like 25% of simulations. It's like 15% for Minnesota and 10% for Green Bay. But for the most part, bye weeks go to Carolina, New England, Arizona, and the winner of Cincinnati, Denver in Week 16. Then we have Kansas City at 6%, Seattle at 5%, and then no one else is above 3%. Now let's contrast that to last year. Last year, 11 teams were listed with at least a 6% chance of winning the Super Bowl at this point.
Wow.
This year it's 5 plus Kansas City, is at 6.0. Now last year was absurdly sort of wide-ranging. I look back at the last few years. 2013 we had 7 teams over 10% at this point, but then a drop-off after that. Whereas this year we have 5 teams. In 2011 and 2012, there were 7 teams over 6%. In 2010, it was 8 teams. So the 6 teams this year is not that much fewer than most years, but because Kansas City barely makes that line, it's really 5 teams with heavy Super Bowl chance. I mean, it is very stratified. The wins and losses are just more important than DVOA. Once we get into the playoffs, the DVOA will become more important. But at that point, there's 5 more weeks of play. First of all, right now, all the teams that we're talking about here are all 7th or higher in DVOA.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And they're all pretty grouped together at the top of the league, except Denver. And if Osweiler really is this much better than Manning was, then Denver really is in that top group.
And the Steelers
so what you end up with is
be
a pretty tight grouping of those top teams who also all get home field. I mean, not all home field in the conference championships, but they all get, 4 of them will get the bye weeks.
So, I mean, it sounds like it could make for pretty good late playoff games. All I know is the stupid Panthers fan in me is really enjoying this because, A, we're in the driver's seat to actually have success, and B, we keep having articles written about how we're the worst 11-0 team ever, and Thomas Davis gets upset. So this is great.
Well,
I love this.
Thomas Davis is not the reason why Carolina might be the worst. If anyone should get upset, it's like Devin Funchess, okay? Or Jericho Country or Michael Orr. They're the reasons why Carolina is not one of the best 11-0 teams ever. It's not Cam Newton, it's not Greg Olsen, and it is not anybody on that defense. I will say about, the Carolina thing. First of all, part of me, even as a Patriots fan, look, I want my team to win the back-to-back. I want to be the best team, best franchise in history, 6 rings, suck it, Goodell, believe me. I am all in favor of those things. But there is a part of me that really would love to see Carolina go 19-0 because I disliked the 1972 Miami Dolphins so much that I want somebody to shut them up, and it does not have to be my team. Okay, because I honestly, people are like, oh my God, do you want to go through 30 years of Cam Newton being like, I'm the best? Sure. I will take Cam Newton's ego over Mercury Morris being a jerk. Please, 1,000 times. Plus, they can't say we're the only one. I mean, we're the only ones who've ever gone 19-0, yeah. But part of the problem with Miami is we're the only ones who ever did it. If Carolina does it too, people can say to them, well, Miami went 17-0 and they didn't get to play 2 more games. They can't be quite as much jerks about it. The other thing I'll say is, I'm going to warn you now, this is not statistically significant, but this is historically significant. You know which franchise has the longest history of blowing up perfect seasons? The New York Giants.
The Giants, yeah.
We know about the Patriots. Some people know about 1934 Chicago was perfect till the NFL championship game in the pre-Super Bowl era when they lost to the Giants. 1998, though, is the year that stands out to me. That's the year that the Giants were 5-8 when they hosted the 13-0 Broncos in Week 15. And when does Carolina go to play the New York Giants?
Week 15.
Week 15. Again, no statistical significance to this, but I think that is the game that the Panthers will lose, and they will finish 14-2 when they rest everybody and play Derek Anderson and stuff in Week 17. I think the most likely ending is that they lose at the Giants, and that they rest everyone and they end up 14-2. Other than that, the hardest games they're going to play are going to be in the playoffs which means there's also a chance that they'll do what the Patriots did, which is go 16-0 and not win the Super Bowl.
That's what I thought your dream would be the Panthers at 18-0 in the Super Bowl against the Patriots, and then the Patriots playing the role of the Giants. I'm not sure.
No. I would much rather have the Panthers lose to Arizona in the NFC Championship game, because the longer that Carolina goes before they lose, the more the 1972 Dolphins will not shut up after it happens. And I just want Mercury Morris to go away. And the idea of another 18-1 with the Dolphins all crowing is horrible. So, no, I almost wonder if I would root for the Panthers. Not against the Patriots, probably, but I would absolutely root for the Panthers if they were playing Cincinnati or Denver. Oh my God, totally.
Welcome to the bandwagon. We are happy to have you, Aaron. All right, I think that's going to about do it for this week's episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.
Away our biases now. People who don't like me for being from New England are going to they know now where I stand on this.
Well, the good news is we always wait for the last 5 minutes to get into like exclusive Panthers Patriots talk mode. So, I think it's okay. They could have just turned it off by now.
We're going to do a 3-hour podcast.
And they've already downloaded the episode,
if the Panthers
so whatever.
And Patriots make it to the Super Bowl, we're going to do like a 3-hour.
And we'll be the only ones to listen to it. But I'm looking forward to it. So all right, Aaron. Well, I hope you enjoy the Week 13 games, and I'll plan to talk to you next week.
All right, let's do it.